Good evening. So this is Western Civilization 1, Lecture 6 for the ninth graders. And in the last lecture, I talked about the formation of barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, which is modern-day France, takes its name from the Franks. The Vandals settled in North Africa. And I told you we'd talk in this lecture about Italy and then Britannia. Well, the last place in the Roman world, in the Western Roman world, remember, we're not talking about the Greek-speaking East. That's a very different story for different lectures in the future. That's the Byzantine Empire in the East is what scholars usually call it. We're talking only about the West, the Latin-speaking West, Italy, and everything west in Europe. But in the Western European Roman Empire, Italy was the last place to still be loyal to a Western Roman emperor. That's no great shock. The city of Rome itself, by the way, had shrunk. It had shrunk mightily. Around 150 AD, there'd been 1 million people in the city of Rome. Biggest place ever in the history of mankind up to then. No place on earth could rival it at all. Chang'an in China, maybe 500,000. Antioch in Syria, maybe 500,000. A little smaller in Alexandria, Egypt. But 1 million people in Rome around 150 AD had been gigantic city. But by the 450s, Rome had shrunk to a fraction of its original, maybe 100,000 people or so, 1/10 its peak population. The city had largely been depopulated. 100,000 was still pretty big as a population center for that time, but it was a shadow of its glory days. I'd mentioned to you before that in the time of the barbarian invasions, the capital was often further away, Milan or the border of Germany, Trier. Eventually it winds up in Ravenna, an island near what's now Venice in the northeast of Italy on the coast, an island in the middle of a swamp because it was relatively safe from attack. But the last people in the Western Roman Empire who swore allegiance to the Roman emperor in the West were the people of northern Italy. But even there, the Roman army, which is what guaranteed a Roman Empire, was falling to pieces. What was left of it was almost entirely Germanic allies. And they meddled in politics. Their chieftains meddled in politics. The most important Roman, quote-unquote, Roman general of the 5th century AD, the 400s AD, was a guy named Stilicho, who was entirely of Germanic origin. And as the Gaul, Spain, Africa, southern Italy eventually lost its allegiance, abandoned its allegiance to the Roman emperors over the course of the 400s. All that was left was the north. And eventually in 476 AD, 476, as I've often mentioned to you, there are roughly a dozen dates that I think every educated person really needs to know by heart. This is a good one to put on that list, 476 AD. Pardon me. 476 AD was the year that the last Western Roman emperor, whose name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, named after the legendary founder of Rome, right? Means little Rome, Romulus. And Augustulus, named after Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, but that ulus on the end means little. So little Rome, little Augustus was his name. He was a 14-year-old boy at the time he was overthrown by his own commander-in-chief, a German chieftain who was technically the head of Roman forces, whose name was Odoacer. He was an Ostrogoth, a German Ostrogoth. He said, "It's silly for me to be bowing and scraping in front of a 14-year-old boy who has no soldiers loyal to him at all except through me." So in 476 AD, Romulus Augustus was forced to abdicate by Odoacer. He was sent to live on a farm. I don't think anybody knows what ultimately happened to the boy. But Odoacer set himself up as king of Italy, just as the chieftain of the Franks had declared himself king of the Franks. The chieftain of the Visigoths had become the king of Hispania. He set himself up as king of Italy. That leaves only Britannia to talk about, and that's a very interesting story. You remember that the island of Great Britain, the area we now call England and Wales, had been occupied by the Romans in the 1st century AD. And for 250 years, they had thoroughly Romanized it. The Celtic peoples who lived there had adopted Roman culture, Roman agriculture. They lived in cities, Roman-style cities, and great villas in the countryside on these large landed estates, the latifundia. Britannia was very much a part of the Western Roman Empire. But as the chaos of the German invasions hit, there was political instability everywhere. Just like in the military anarchy back in the 200s AD, the 400s AD were typified by rebellious army units whose generals thought they should be emperor. And around the year 408 AD, one of these generals, a general in Gaul, held himself up as Roman emperor. He called himself Constantius III. And he claimed to be emperor. Of course, only his soldiers in the area right around Gaul that he had military control on recognized him as emperor. But the emperor in Rome sent an order to the Roman legions in Britannia to cross the English Channel into Gaul to fight Constantius III, this usurper in Gaul. So all the Roman troops in Britannia evacuated in 408 AD. They all went to Gaul to fight. They would never come back. So you had this prosperous urban and countryside estate society of Roman Britain left undefended by the Roman army. Now, north of what's now England, what's today is Scotland, the people who lived there were barbarians called the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, the Picts. And they were a nasty lot. They were only semi-civilized at this time. They were extremely warlike. The Romans were frightened of them. The guys would go in, these Picts would go into battle stark naked, painted blue. Can you imagine those guys coming after you? And the Romans built a big set of walls. Remember we talked about Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britannia? To keep them out. And it worked pretty well until there were no soldiers guarding that wall. And then the Picts came over it, the Picts broke through it, and they started invading Britannia. Shortly after the Roman troops left in 408, it was a mess. These great estates, these cities were being sacked, people being killed. The Picts were making a mess. And naturally, the leaders of Britannic society sent a request to the emperor, please send back the soldiers. We need help. But by then, the emperor had more than enough on his plate with a usurper, with Germanic invaders. Trying to hold on to this island off the coast of Europe was not in the cards at that time. And the emperor sent a very famous note in response to this request for help. It said, His Imperial Majesty instructs his loyal subjects in Britannia to look to their own defenses. Literally, you're on your own. And they knew they couldn't manage themselves against these fierce barbarians. So what they did is they hired their own Germanic barbarians to fight the Pictish barbarians. They got mercenaries from what was then northern Germania. We would call it northern Holland. southern Denmark, and northwest Germany, Saxony. And the three nations of Germans they brought over were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Mercenaries from these three groups of Germans, they were all Germanic, but they were different ethnic groups. The Angles and the Saxons, the most numerous, the Jutes not so much. From this area of northern Holland, southern Denmark, northwest Germany, came by boat across the North Sea and came to work as mercenaries for the people of Britannia to fight the Picts. And they did a very good job. These Angles and Saxons were very fierce fighters, and they defeated the Picts. They drove them back. But according to one of the earliest historians of that period, a guy named the Venerable Bede, he wrote the story a couple of centuries later, and he said that the Britannic people didn't pay up like they were supposed to. They didn't pay the mercenaries appropriately for the work they'd done. And these German mercenaries decided that they would take it inland. They knew that the land they were visiting, Britain was a marvelous agricultural land. They lived in swampland in their homeland, and they liked what they saw. They saw a future in Britannia, and they began to settle. They took land, and since the Britannic people were in no position to fight them, they took the land, settled, sent messages, sent boats back home. Come on over. This place is great. And over the course of the next 70 or 80 years, huge numbers of Germans, Angles and Saxons especially, came to Britannia and settled. So many of them that today almost all the place names in England are Anglo and Saxon names. They swamped the people who lived there culturally. Now we know from genetic analysis the people of England are descended from Romano-Celtic people and Germanic Anglo-Saxon people blended together. So genetically they blended, but culturally the Angles and the Saxons, whom we start calling one group the Anglo-Saxons, these Germanic peoples that came over and settled in Britannia. That was in the late 400s, the early 500s. They took over 2/3 of the island of Great Britain. So that by the middle of the 500s, people were beginning to call it not Britannia any longer, the old Roman name, but Ungaland, the land of the Angles. Though the south, it was actually Saxons down there. So the place names in England today, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, that sex on the end is for Saxon. The Angles mostly settled in the north, the Jutes on some islands in the south and in the very southeast corner of the island. But England, as we know it, was born of this Germanic invasion of Angles and Saxons and Jutes, late 400s, early 500s AD, who swamped and intermarried with the Celtic and Roman peoples of Britannia. And a new culture would be born. So when we start talking about the early Middle Ages in England, it is this Anglo-Saxon England. And the language I am speaking to you today, at its very core, are the Germanic languages of these mercenaries who came to England and stayed. English is a Germanic language, not a Romance language. It is not genetically descended from Latin. It has a lot of Latin loanwords in it, has a lot of French words in it that came in later, but at its heart, the key homey language of English is German. Mother, Mutter. Father, Vater. House, Haus. Cow, Kuh. Bread, Brot. All these everyday things, these family things, Bruder, brother, Schwester, sister. German and English, on the most home things, it's German at the core of our language, not the Romance languages. Okay? We'll continue with lecture number 7. Thank you.